I stepped into the elevator, my mind already racing through the day's demands. Deadlines, meetings, and texts left unanswered. It was all a blur. I barely registered the soft chime as the doors began to slide shut, and then a voice. "Hold the elevator." Instinct took over, and I jammed my hand between the doors. They hesitated, then obediently opened again. That's when I saw him. For a second, it was like the air shifted. There he stood, just as I remembered. His sharp jawline, the way his shirt clung to his frame, and those eyes, so familiar it hurt. A rush of memories hit me. Lazy Sunday mornings tangled in each other's arms. His laugh filling the spaces of my apartment. The way he'd look at me like I was the only one that mattered. Before I could process it, he was inside, the doors closing us in together. "Hey," he said, his voice careful. "Hey," I replied, avoiding his gaze. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. I could feel my pulse quicken. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing him again. It was the weight of everything we'd been, everything we weren't anymore. The elevator jerked slightly as it began its ascent, and I stole a glance at him. He looked good. Too good. And I hated that I noticed. We stood there, two people with a past too loud for the quiet space. And just like that, the day's demands were forgotten. The soft whir of the elevator was the only sound between us, filling the void left by words neither of us seemed willing to say. "Long time," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice carried a familiar warmth, but the tone was cautious. "Yeah," I managed, keeping my eyes on the glowing floor numbers above the doors. "How've you been?" "Good," he replied too quickly. "You?" "Good," I echoed, though it sounded hollow. The pause that followed felt heavier than it should have. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. He was standing there, hands in his pockets, looking like he had somewhere more important to be. It made me wonder if he was as uncomfortable as I was, or if he had already moved past what we once were. What had it been? 2 years? 2 years since our last fight. The one that ended everything. I could still remember the way his voice broke when he said, "Maybe we're just too different." I didn't even try to stop him from walking out the door. I thought I'd be over it by now. But standing next to him again, all I could think about was how good it used to be. The way he'd trace patterns on my back when we talked late into the night. The way he knew exactly how to calm me when I was overwhelmed. The way he made me feel safe, even when everything else was falling apart. And then the way it all unraveled. The elevator jolted suddenly, throwing me slightly off balance. I instinctively grabbed the handrail, my heart skipping a beat. The lights flickered, and then everything stopped. Movement, sound, everything. "What just happened?" he asked, looking at me, his brows furrowing. I pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. "I think we're stuck," I said, trying to sound calm. He ran a hand through his hair, a habit I remembered all too well. "Great," he muttered under his breath, his frustration barely contained. And just like that, we were trapped. Nowhere to go. No way to avoid the tension that had been building since the moment he walked in. Minutes ticked by, though it felt longer in the stillness. My fingers hovered over the emergency button, pressing it again out of sheer hope. Nothing. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, pacing in the limited space. "Why isn't anyone answering?" "It's not like I have control over the situation," I said, sharper than I intended. His head snapped toward me. "I didn't say you did." "Then stop acting like I'm the problem," I shot back, crossing my arms. "Wow," he said, his tone turning icy. "Same old you, always defensive." I turned to face him fully, the irritation bubbling up before I could stop it. "And you're the same, always needing to blame someone else when things go wrong. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. You never change, do you? Everything always had to be about winning with you? Winning? You think that's what I cared about? I felt my voice rising, years of pent-up frustration pouring out. Maybe if you'd actually listened instead of running away every time things got hard, we wouldn't be here. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't respond. But then he stepped closer, his voice lower but no less intense. You think I ran? I stayed longer than I should have, hoping you'd let me in, but you always had one foot out the door. His words hit harder than I expected. I had one foot out the door? That's rich coming from someone who gave up without even trying to fix things. We stared at each other, the air thick with everything we'd avoided saying for years. I could feel my chest tightening, the frustration giving way to something else. Something I wasn't ready to admit. I never gave up, he said softly after a moment, his voice losing its edge. I just didn't know how to reach you anymore. I looked away, my heart pounding. He wasn't wrong, and hearing him say it felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't mean to shut you out, I admitted, barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to deal with the way I felt. You meant so much to me, and I was scared of losing you. And then I did anyway. When I glanced back at him, his expression had softened. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since the doors closed, his gaze wasn't filled with frustration. It was something else. Something that made my stomach flip. I didn't want to lose you either, he said, taking a small step closer. But we were both so caught up in trying to be right, we forgot what we were fighting for. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with meaning, with words we didn't need to say. I could feel the tension shift between us, but this time it wasn't anger. I leaned back against the elevator wall, exhaling slowly, the weight of everything hanging between us. The argument had stripped away the polite masks, leaving us standing there, raw and exposed. I guess I should say, I'm sorry, I said, breaking the silence. My voice felt smaller than usual, like I was treading on fragile ground. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. For what? For everything, I admitted. For shutting you out. For thinking I could handle everything on my own. I thought, if I didn't lean on you, then losing you wouldn't hurt as much. His expression softened, his lips pressing into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. You don't have to carry everything alone, you know. You never did. The truth of his words stung, but it also warmed something inside me. What about you? I asked, hesitant. How have you been? He hesitated, as if weighing how honest he wanted to be. It's been fine. Work's been good. Life's been quiet, I guess. Quiet doesn't sound like you, I said, and it earned a small laugh from him. I know, right? He replied, a flicker of his old charm breaking through. I thought I'd enjoy the peace, but it's lonely. My chest tightened at the admission, and for a moment I couldn't meet his eyes. I've missed you, I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His breath hitched, and I saw something shift in his expression. Something tender, almost vulnerable. I've missed you too, he said, his voice quieter now. The memory came to me suddenly, unbidden, but so vivid it felt like I was there again. Do you remember that time we got caught in the rain? I asked, my lips curving into a smile despite myself. He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. How could I forget? You were furious about your shoes getting ruined. And you kept laughing at me, I said, shaking my head. But then you pulled me into that tiny cafe, and we sat there for hours, soaked, drinking terrible coffee. And you made fun of my hair the entire time, he added, his grin widening. I laughed, and for a moment the tension melted away. It was just us again, sharing something that no one else could understand. He stepped closer, and I felt my pulse quicken. His gaze held mine, and in it I saw everything. The regret, the longing, the spark that had never really gone out. I thought about that day so many times, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was one of the last times I felt happy. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. We were happy once, I said, the words thick with emotion. His hand moved slightly, almost as if he wanted to reach for me, but wasn't sure if he should. And in that moment, I realized that whatever had gone wrong between us, the love we shared had never really left. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name but didn't want to escape. I watched his hand hovering between us, hesitating as if the weight of all our history rested on that simple gesture. Without thinking, I reached out, letting my fingers brush against his. He didn't pull away. I never wanted to lose you, I said, my voice trembling slightly. But I didn't know how to hold on without messing it all up. His fingers curled around mine, tentative at first, then more certain. You weren't the only one afraid, he said. I was too. Maybe I still am. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my chest ache. This was the same man I had fallen for years ago, the one who made me laugh when I wanted to cry, who stayed up with me on sleepless nights, who somehow always knew when I needed him, even when I couldn't admit it. I don't know if we can fix what's broken, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper, but I've never stopped wanting to try. He stepped closer, closing the already small distance between us. His hand moved to my cheek, his touch gentle but deliberate. My breath caught as his thumb brushed against my skin, the familiarity of it stirring something deep inside me. I thought about this, he said softly, his eyes searching mine. Being close to you again, saying everything I should have said back then. And now that we're here, he trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Then say it. For a moment, he just looked at me, as if trying to gather the courage. And then, without another word, he leaned in. His lips met mine, tentative at first, then more certain as I kissed him back. It wasn't rushed or frantic, it was steady, warm, and achingly familiar, like finding something you thought you'd lost forever. He made a move to grab my rod, but I stopped him, saying softly, "Not so fast. This place doesn't seem right." When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine. Neither of us spoke, but we didn't need to. The connection we shared, the one we thought had been lost, was still there, as strong as ever. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Me too," I replied. "But maybe this time we don't have to do it alone." The elevator shuddered suddenly, the lights flickering back to life. We pulled apart slightly, reality creeping back in. But even as the doors opened, spilling light and noise into our small space, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, I wasn't ready to let him go again. The elevator jolted again, this time more gently, and the soft whir of its motor filled the air as it began to move upward. I could hear the faint sounds of life outside the confined space, footsteps, voices, the bustle of the building. But for a moment, everything felt distant, as if we were suspended in our own world, the past and present mixing together in the quiet space between us. We both stepped back, the closeness lingering between us like a heavy but comforting weight. My hand still tingled where his had touched mine, and I could feel the heat from his body pressing against the space between us, but I couldn't hold on to this forever. The elevator doors finally opened, and a burst of light flooded in. For a moment, I didn't move. Neither of us did. "So," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "What now?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and everything seemed clearer than it had in a long time. There was no perfect answer to the question, no magic solution that would erase the pain or the mistakes. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild something, slowly, carefully. "I don't know," I replied, my voice soft. "But I want to try." His eyes softened and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I want that too." We stood there for a moment longer, letting the decision settle between us. It wasn't an easy choice. It wasn't a perfect one. But it was a real one. "I guess we'll figure it out," I said, breaking the silence, though my heart was still heavy with the uncertainty of what the future might bring. He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine for just a moment longer, and then he stepped out of the elevator. I followed him, the sounds of the building coming back to life around us. The world outside was still moving, still full of noise and chaos, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a quiet hope stirring inside me. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. We weren't the same people who had stepped into that elevator. And maybe that was the first step toward finding our way back to each other. Have you ever reconnected with an ex? How did it go for you? Share your experience in the comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel to see how their story ended. We are Pride Stories Unfiltered, your #1 pride.